afternoon to our CLA family members, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our live stream. We sincerely hope that you are all staying safe and healthy at this time. Today, we're coming together to discuss where things stand with the Build Back Better plan on Capitol Hill, and we have Omar Nashashibi in the house to help us understand some of the content, timeframes, and items to explore as it relates to this current legislation. We also have a topic that is dear to me on the agenda today, and that's the Employee Retention Credit. Christine DiMenna and I will discuss where things stand, as well as the IRS Notice 2021-65 released on Monday that addresses the early repeal of the credit, as well as some of the relief for employers who had reduced their withholding deposits prior to that repeal in the fourth quarter. Now, before we get started, we're going to quickly review our housekeeping items. As you know, we have activated live Q&A so that we can interact with you during the show. If you're registered, you may add your questions and also like the questions of others to move them up in priority so that we can answer them during our time together. I'd like to urge you to subscribe to the CLA YouTube channel and hit that like button on the live stream so that they're easy to find and so that you're notified of them in the future. In addition to our live streams, we are starting to add more great content, more great webinars to the calendar starting in January. So to stay up to date on these offerings, be sure to check out our events page on CLAconnect.com and subscribe to receive future invitations from us. Also, you can visit our events page on CLAconnect.com to register and find other relevant information for yourself and your organizations, or watch those replays of things that we might have put on in the past and you haven't had time to get to. Finally, please continue to engage with your advisors here at CLA. We're always sharing articles and white papers, and we're looking forward to interacting with you specifically when you use that Contact Us button on the webpage. So now that that's out of the way, I'd like to kick off the conversation with Omar. It is so great to have you back, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
So Omar, we know that Congress frequently misses some of these self-imposed deadlines, just like what we saw with the ERC, but we're wondering where we are now with the Build Back Better plan after it passed the U.S. House on November 19th.
Yeah, there's no question. You want to guarantee something in Congress every year, they're going to miss deadlines. Just the only thing they can't move is Christmas and New Year's, and they're really trying their best to go right up against that as well. It's really, it gets worse and worse, it seems like, every year, but they really are planning on sessions potentially up until that Wednesday and even Thursday going into the Christmas Eve. So it's going into that Friday. So they're looking at a long schedule here in the next couple of weeks, trying to get a lot done. But it's important to understand the reason is because the Senate has procedures and they have to go through it. And any senator can force them to go and use up all the time and the clock that's there and available to them. And those procedural hurdles right now are many of the issues before you even get to the policy. So let's just take a quick look at where this is. As you mentioned, this is passed here from the U.S. House a few weeks ago. It's been in the Senate. Frankly, it's been in the Senate since the summer, where we've been negotiating in public, it feels like, with Manchin and Sinema between the two of them. But the House passed their version. The Senate really has to create their own because the House doesn't have the same procedural hurdles through reconciliation, what we call the Byrd rule, that the Senate has to go through. And that's what the Senate's going through right now. Through the weekend, 8 of the 12 committees that were assigned reconciliation instructions had completed their sections of the bill. Their language had been submitted to the Senate parliamentarian. She and her staff had completed their reviews through the weekend, and the GOP is looking at them. So they're made some pretty good progress through the weekend, but they still hadn't gotten to some of the larger ones, such as the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and of course, the Senate Finance Committee, which addresses taxes. But yesterday, on December 8th, we did see some additional progress. The Congressional Budget Office did proceed and issue a notice on its what we call score of the bill, how much different sections are going to cost. And that's another important procedural hurdle for the Senate to move forward. So now that we've got more from the CBO, that's helpful. We've increasingly cleared the parliamentarian on the non-controversial provisions that are out there. But the issue right now that you've got yesterday, we did get some more, as I said, CBO. We also had 4 committees release actual language that's out there, Senate Banking, Commerce, Small Business, and Veterans Affairs. So we have all of that information now in writing. But as you heard me say a moment ago, the parliamentarian has cleared the non-controversial items. I'm hearing the big ones are still coming up next week.
Well, and I guess that's the question, right? You've told us where we are now and how we got here, but where's this bill going? Like, what is the latest timeline with some of these bigger issues for Build Back Better in the Senate?
All right, and the last several weeks have been looking at procedures and where they need to go from here. There's still a lot of policy issues that they've got to work out, but the ambitious timeline, it makes it difficult to see how they get to the end goal here. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said he wants to move on this next week. Isn't just the week of December 13th, in just a few days. And as you just heard me say, we're not entirely finished with some of the language, though, some of the biggest language that they've got to deal with, to be honest. What I'm hearing is, for a moment, before we even get to Build Back Better, we potentially on tonight, this is December 9th, we might have a vote on the debt ceiling in the Senate. We're hearing that could be teed up. Senators are itching to go home. So if they don't do it tonight, it'll be on Monday. And that's limited to 10 hours of debate. So there's pretty much a day right there dedicated to the debt limit. Then we have the National Defense Authorization Act, which has passed every year since 1961. Please, at least Congress, don't break this streak, is what most of us are saying. If they keep it going, that's going to eat up at least another 2 to 3 days, potentially. As you see where I'm going, you have Monday, Tuesday, when Schumer wants to get this done by the end of next week, and he's running out of legislative business days. Most of us believe from a procedural best case scenario, Build Back Better is going to take 4 legislative days. So that puts us at 8. And again, you can't move Christmas. You're running out of time for them to be able to move forward. As I mentioned, I think that's actually pretty quick if they could move something of this magnitude, to be honest, by then. But again, they've been working on it all summer. They know that this was coming. They knew about these deadlines. And where we are right now is they're going through what we call the bird bath. That is when the Senate parliamentarian meets with the Senate Democrats drafting the language, and they say immigration is in, this part is out, this part is controversial, this one will not meet the rule. The reason the parliamentarian is involved is because Senate Democrats don't have 60 votes. They're going through a procedure called reconciliation where they only need 50 votes, similar to what Republicans did in December, around now, of 2017 on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that's why we're dealing with the Senate parliamentarian taking additional days in order to determine what can be in. And that's why I said there's a Senate version and there's a House version. And keep in mind that Joe Manchin still is not in agreement on this bill. So I'm just talking about procedural issues right now of the timing of this. So let's just play it out. Schumer wants to go on this next week. Few of us believe they can complete by even this time next week. That's just unlikely. There is a chance some of us in town believe this does get done by New Year's, but in the Senate. We do not see the House passing Build Back Better by December 31st at this point. It's possible. Anything is possible. But we're hearing Pelosi's going to bring him back next week to vote on the debt ceiling, and then pretty much they're gone till January 10th. Now, again, things can change. She wants to get this done. But right now, it's difficult to see. We can see it getting through the Senate by the end of the year, but it's very difficult at this point for the House to be able to pull it back. Because again, remember, this has to go back to the House before it gets to the president.
Right. And so, I mean, we do see that ambitious timeline from Senator Schumer, right, along with some of these unresolved issues. And I was going to make a comment, Omar, I have to say about there being a bird bath and some of the nibbling ducks. And I know Christine always appreciates that, but I guess when we talk about those nibbling ducks, you know, really what we're talking about in this case are some of the top line issues that are still unresolved. And is there some short-term pathway to find solutions to those and get to a vote in this aggressive time frame that Schumer's looking for?
That's right. We have to keep in mind this has already been scaled back a number of times. We came out from the House in the 1.8 range, where Senate's talking the 1.7 range, Manchin's talking 1.5, if anything at all at this point. And that's even coming down from where progressives started this conversation. To your point, remember over the summer, we were talking about minimum wage. That went through a bird bath over the summer, and the Senate parliamentarian said no, it violated the rule because it did not have its specific and initial purpose was not a budgetary impact. It was more of a policy impact. And that's where you're seeing some potentially of some of the immigration areas. They're more policy. A reconciliation has to have the budgetary impact being true to the initial purpose of the provision. The provision itself has to be focused on the budgetary impact. And that's how the constraints with which the Senate Democrats are working, because again, they have to meet that 50 vote threshold. What you're seeing in the press is fairly accurate to what we're hearing up on Capitol Hill, but the pressure point, going back to timing and policy, combining them, the child tax credit. Democrats really want to see the child tax credit extended. It expires here on December 31st, last checks out. And that's a real concern for Democrats as they examine politically their fate in 2022. And that's why you are continuing to see pressure. We are hearing Pelosi is not going to peel off child tax credit and do a standalone extension at the end of the year. We are not hearing that as an option. The House wants to keep pressure on the Senate on the entirety of Build Back Better. That's what we're hearing on that policy provision out there. I'm actually hearing Ways and Means is not even going to draft any type of child tax credit extension. They want to keep that type of pressure on the Senate to move in there. Does sound like paid leave is out, although there's still a chance that Neal pulls something off. That one seems like Manchin really does want a bipartisan solution on there. Medicare expansion, that Bernie's pushing, we could hear on hearing aids, that one might pull off there in that area. But the last issue isn't so much as policy, but the current political environment and economic environment, and that's Manchin's concern over inflation. Today, again, is the 9th. Tomorrow's December 10th. There's a joke going around D.C. now that more important than jobs number day is inflation day. Every month on the 10th, you're going to get the inflation numbers, and that's really what the White House is concerned about. That's what Manchin's concerned about. He believes at this point more money going out is a concern. And that, frankly, is an overarching policy issue, even beyond some of the different specific provisions that I just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really insightful. And then specific to taxes, we've started to see the Senate committee release their parts of the bill, as you said. Where are we with the Senate Finance Committee, and what is still unresolved in the tax space?
And this is the same as over in the House. When you all remember that week of September 13th, 14th, 15th, the big markups, Ways and Means is always the last one to go in the House side. They're the tax writers. In the Senate, Finance is usually, in this case, going to be the last one to go, the tax writers. Unfortunately, in this case, that's because the tax writers are still writing. What we're hearing in there's a few areas. The R&D tax credit is in, not controversial at this point. We're hearing it's not a threat to be bounced out. So 174 seems to be pretty secure. The electric vehicle tax, two issues that we're hearing on that one. One is international, one is domestic. Internationally, they're viewing it, our trading partners, as an illegal subsidy that would put U.S. industry ahead of their trading partners, and especially a violation of the new NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. Domestically, it's an issue because there's further incentives for union electric vehicles, and that, of course, is upsetting Southern senators, including Senator Joe Manchin, who is a non-organized plant in the state of West Virginia. That one is a controversial tax provision that likely will have to have some issues addressed there, but the big one is book minimum tax. This one is still being, I don't want to say formulated, but I don't think it has full buy-in over in the Senate based on conversations that we're having over in that chamber. There are some issues coming out. They want to look at guardrails. Many companies want exemptions. We know the renewable energy industry is certainly coming out and saying the book minimum 15% would disincentivize some of our activities that the government, this administration in particular, is actually wanting to incentivize. And that's where some of those issues that are coming up there. It's a slippery slope if you provide exemptions. We know Senator Elizabeth Warren is opposed to any carve-outs for any groups that are out there. And that book minimum tax probably needs to get fleshed out through this weekend. We're hoping to see a little bit more in the Monday, Tuesday timeframe from Senate Finance Committee to get better sense. And then the last one on international, or second to last, international taxation provisions. We know 163N on interest deductibility for those. That is in right now. We believe something along the lines of 163N will be in the final Senate package. The question is, what does it look like? And they're still working through the 15% global minimum tax effective date. That's a big concern. They believe that January 2023 is too early. And then last, no conversation on taxes in Congress is complete without SALT, state and local tax deduction. It is not going to be the provisions that came out of the House. I think most of us have known that for some time. They are talking about a lower exemption threshold for certain earners, and that way they couldn't be accused of a tax giveaway to the rich. Other options might be a 2-year suspension of the state and local tax deduction, $10,000 limit, just to get them through the next election cycle. But that also might be paired with a limitation on for who would be eligible for it. Those are the tax provisions that are up there, at least from now, but they're going to be working through the weekend.
Well, and that makes sense. And, where would we be if we weren't talking about the SALT deduction and effective dates, right? So, Omar, thank you so much for that update. I know we're going to have you back to talk a little bit more about what's been proposed for the ERC too, as Christine dives deeper into her part, and then again, as things move forward, probably in early January. So really appreciate you keeping us informed and letting us know what to expect. I would like to turn now to something that seems to be on everybody's mind, which is the employee retention credit. So welcome, Christine. It's really good to have you back.
Thanks, Jen.
I was wondering if we could start, I'm still seeing questions coming in every day where people are just wondering, where do things stand generally with employee retention credit in Q4? So before we even dive into Monday's notice, can you catch us up to date on where things are?
Absolutely. For Q4, as we know from the infrastructure bill, that eliminated the employee retention credit for Q4 of 2021 for everyone except a recovery startup. So any entities that had been planning on those funds for Q4 or were proactively taking that credit for Q4 are affected by that new legislation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And there is still the allowance for the credit for the recovery startup businesses in Q4. Can you talk to me about what those are and what limitations apply? Because there is still a limited sliver, right, of people who, or organizations who could take advantage of the credit in Q4.
That's right, Jen. That's the only organization right now that can take the credit in Q4 as the recovery startup business. So just a brief refresher, to qualify as a recovery startup business, you have to be an employer who began carrying on your trade or business after February 15th of 2020. Your average annual gross receipts for the 3 years prior to when you're claiming the credit are not in excess of $1 million. And the actual credit you can claim is a maximum of $50,000 per quarter in Q3 and in Q4. With that maximum credit of $50,000 per quarter, if you have a handful of employees, so less than 8 employees, you're going to max out if they all had the maximum eligible wages. So if you are a recovery startup in Q3, you still have the option of qualifying under the gross receipts test or the partial shutdown if that's more advantageous. But that avenue is gone for Q4. You have to meet those other criteria.
Yeah, and it's a super limited credit at that point. I mean, one thing we've been telling folks is, look, even if you qualify as recovery startup in Q3, but you meet the other criteria, go ahead and take it the other way because you're going to broaden your credit. But in Q4, that recovery startup business provision is still available, and that's the only, at this point, definition of an eligible employer that we can apply. So I think that's really helpful. So now the big news that we buried this week, at least, came from our IRS notice 2021-65. Do you want to talk to me about what's in there and maybe even what's not in there? Because I was hoping for a little bit more in this notice, but why don't you start unpacking it and tell us what's in there first?
So for what's in there, there are 3 parts to the notice. The first part provides additional guidance related to that termination of the credit for the Q4 of 2021. It kind of goes through and clarifies the rules on how to qualify based on gross receipts or partial expansion, and that being no longer available for businesses in Q4, including for those severely financially distressed employers. So only the recovery startup businesses can continue to claim the credit in Q4 if they qualify under that definition. The second part addresses situations where employers had requested advance payments of the employee retention credit for wages paid in Q4 prior to enactment of the infrastructure bill. Again, unless they qualify as a recovery startup, they must repay these advances by the due date of the applicable Q4 employment tax return. And they have stated failure to do so may result in penalties. So then we move on to the last part of the notice, which talks about those penalties. So that states that failure to deposit penalties for employers who reduce their deposits in anticipation of the ERC will not be waived after December 20th, 2021, except for those recovery startups. So for deposits due on or before 12/20 related to those wages paid for Q4, employers who are not a recovery startup will not be subject to those failure deposit penalties if they meet 3 criteria. The first, they had to have reduced their deposits in anticipation of the ERC. They deposit the amounts initially retained in anticipation of the ERC on or before the relevant due date for your wages paid on 12/31/21. And the employer then has to report that tax liability resulting from the termination on your employment tax return for Q4 2021.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And a good summary of everything we saw in that notice. One thing that's kind of frustrating is, as you walk through like the 3 criteria, one of the things that's kind of frustrating about the notice is it doesn't tell us how to do this procedurally, like how you would show the reason why you reduced your deposits was in anticipation of the retention credit. So that's something we'll have to unpack. But how are you recommending that people proceed at this point?
First, if you have not stopped making those advanced payment reductions and you're not a recovery startup, stop them immediately. I would suggest working with your CLA advisor and or your payroll company to make sure that any funds you did take in advance are redeposited before that due date for wages paid through 12/31. And that date, wording of that date is a little unclear, but to be safe, I would return those funds prior to the end of December regardless.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would too. And certainly your point about, look, if you've somehow turned off your pay-in, make sure you activate that switch again so that you're not somehow continuing to reduce your reduction or your deposits. Sorry, reduce your reduction, reduce your deposits for that. So, one thing I was hoping for was that we'd see some more opining from the IRS related to our nibbling ducks that we have here, right, about supply chain and provider relief funds and other matters. And we didn't get that. So are you still hopeful that we'll see another notice from the IRS addressing these things?
That would certainly make everyone's lives easier. It'd be great to be able to herd those nibbling ducks we've been talking about all of these months back into their coop and remove those gray areas that we're all dealing with. I'm still holding out hope, but as time goes on, it's seemingly less likely that we'll get much more clarity than we have to date, but I really, really hope that I am wrong.
Yeah, I do too. And it's interesting because, Omar, I'd like to pull you in and see if you have any thoughts on the IRS noticing any of this out further, especially as we talk about, we'll be asking you in a minute about the latest piece of legislation. But Omar, in your experience, are you familiar with the IRS coming back with additional notices or what it takes to trigger that?
Well, there's certainly pressure coming from Capitol Hill, and that we definitely do know. And it's also coming from the business community with regards to a little bit more clarity. A lot of folks, I remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about, can we at least change the date from October 1st effectively to November 15th, the day that the law was signed in, to at least provide some relief. But now we're moving just from relief to confusion to hopefully relief from both. And from the financial and from the uncertainty that you're looking out there. And it'll be difficult to see the IRS, if they think that Congress is close to passing maybe a change or some kind of a temporary extension just for that quarter, that they would come out with an additional update. But it really depends on what we might see from Capitol Hill in that space. And we might actually see some action there.
Well, and maybe while we've got you, it makes sense just to have you address the bill that was introduced yesterday about restoring the credit for Q4. Could you spend a little time talking us through that?
Absolutely. There was a bill introduced yesterday on December 8th by 4 members of Congress. All 4 of them are members of the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee, which is extremely important. And they're all great members to work with. One of them, in fact, was one of the original creators of the Employee Retention Tax Credit up on Capitol Hill. I remember when we talked to Senate staff as they were discussing eliminating this as part of the infrastructure bill back in July, they weren't getting much pushback from the business community, from the employer community on this. And frankly, a lot of us were surprised. We were all surprised by the $8.2 billion score that they came out saying that it would generate in just that 1 month or 1 quarter elimination. So the bill, what I'm hearing is they're trying to get it included in Build Back Better. It would reinstate it for the 4th quarter. Since they are on the Tax Writing Committee, we do give it more weight. But there's a challenge. It's coming out of the House. The Senate's close to wrapping. They're trying to lower the cost of the Senate bill, not add an increase to it. I don't want to call it a long shot. It's an uphill battle for sure, but lobbyists like me are certainly making a run at it. But I do know the Hill staff, the House side, is looking at Build Back Better or any other vehicle because it won't pass by itself. It'll likely get tied into it. So if I can't get it in a BBB, I'm going to be checking for tax extenders as my next vehicle possibly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, that's going to be, as we were talking about this before our session today, it's going to be a mess, right? If you had reduced your withholding deposits and the credit went away for Q4, then you go through the procedural notice from the IRS that Christine was just talking about and pay everything back. And then you have the opportunity to, assuming it's reinstated, then you have to file for the credit again. So I think we're going to have a bit of a mess to unpack if that should pass. But it's, for a lot of our clients, I know, and a lot of the people watching today, I know it's probably a good mess to have to deal with if that should be reinstated. So one thing I'd like to talk about now before we turn to some of these great questions that we're seeing is, Christine, I was wondering if, getting back to what we do know, because I know there's confusion about this too as it relates to the end of the year. A lot of organizations are concerned that if they don't get those 941Xs filed for 2020 or the first 3 quarters of 21, that the credit's going to go away. So can you talk about what's still available to employers as it relates to the credit that hasn't been eliminated?
So the periods where organizations are eligible for the credit, those quarters where they're qualifying and it's available to them, they have 3 years from the date of the originally filed 941 to go back and amend a form to claim that. So the fact that it's eliminated for virtually everyone except for those recovery startups in Q4 doesn't mean you've lost your chance to go back in time and amend those 2020 returns or those first 3 quarters of 2021 as well. The other piece of that to remember is those credits have to go as a wage reduction in the tax year that they apply to for your tax return. So that could cause a little bit of urgency for some that want to either get this on their tax return timely filed in the year that it applies to, or don't want to wait too long to go back and amend those 2020 returns.
I agree. I think that's going to be the biggest urgency. Plus, people want to get the wheels moving to get their cash
the money
in hand, of course. And that leads us to one of our first questions from the audience, which is, look, if we have filed for, if we filed our 941X and we haven't received the payment yet, do we really have to make the M1 adjustment? And in the year that it was, in the year that the credit was generated. So wonder if you could maybe take us back through the provision in Notice 2021-49 to give the answer to that question.
Yeah, and that kind of relates to what I was just saying. If you took a credit for 2020, that has to go against your 2020 wages on that tax return. So you do have to go back and amend that return. Same for 2021, even if you file for your credits after you file your 2021 tax return, you're going to have to go back and amend that return.
That's correct. And so I think all of those are good points, and it's great information, Christine. I really appreciate that. Omar, we've got one more for you before we wrap up, which is, how is SALT most likely to play out in 2021, or does that all depend on Build Back Better?
It definitely depends on Build Back Better, and Build Back Better depends on SALT. You will not have that bill pass without some kind of SALT relief. I am saying that in a definitive way. That is pretty well known around town, that Tom Suozzi, who's now running for governor of New York, was a House member, and then you've got a New Jersey member, Congress, Gottheimer. They're not going to vote for this bill. You've got a number of, this is New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, and of course, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is from New York. I'm hearing that Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Bob Menendez, a senator from New Jersey, each have their own separate proposals on SALT. You will have this issue addressed if and when you do have a BBB go through, but you will not have Build Back Better without something being addressed. We just don't see it being the status quo based on our sources in the House.
Omar, thanks so much. That's really helpful, and it's a good recap kind of where things stand and where we started. So really appreciate your insight today as well. And amazingly, that is all we have time for. We've hit our 30 minutes together today, and I feel like we could keep this discussion going for days. So thank you so much to Christine, to you, and Omar, to you for your insights, to you and the audience for engaging in your good questions. I know we'll continue to have more from our National Tax Office. Christine and I are actually working on an article for employers as far as things they need to consider before year end, different credit opportunities and other things that are going to be very relevant prior to the end of the year and certainly going into their 2022 planning. So stay on the lookout for that. In the meantime, please stay safe and healthy. We look forward to seeing you next week, and take care.